I want to transport you, just for a moment, to a very specific place and time. So close your eyes if you can.
Oh, yeah. This is a great exercise.
Right. We are going to travel to an 80-acre cow pasture. It's called Huffman Prairie.
Hmm.
It's situated just outside of Dayton, Ohio, and the time is the autumn of 1905. I really want you to picture this, like this whole sensory setup.
Put yourself right in the middle of it.
Exactly. You're standing in the long grass. The autumn wind is, it's rustling through the trees that ring the field.
Yeah.
And in the background, you can hear the lazy, sort of metallic clanking of cowbells.
Hmm.
And over on the very edge of the pasture, there is this distant, rhythmic clatter of an electric interurban trolley car just running along the road.
It's just the absolute picture of pastoral, early 20th century American quiet,
Totally. It is completely peaceful, but then that quiet is broken.
Very abruptly broken.
Yeah. Suddenly there's this rough, sputtering sound. It's a mechanical engine coughing to life. You hear the sharp clatter of a chain being engaged.
Like a heavy bicycle chain.
Right, exactly. And you hear the distinct heavy sound of wood and metal skidding along a wooden rail. And then there's this sustained mechanical drone that simply does not stop.
It just keeps going.
It rises above the cowbells, it rises above the trolley car, and it keeps going. You look up and you see an impossible sight.
Truly impossible for the time.
You see a man sitting out in the open on the lower wing of a machine, and he is flying.
Yeah.
He isn't just gliding off a hill, and he isn't just taking some, long, uncontrolled hop. He is banking in the air.
Actively steering.
Yes. He is turning. He is actively circling this cow pasture for 20 minutes at a stretch, entirely in control before setting the machine down exactly where he intended to.
It is a profound image. I mean, by every single account of human history leading up to that very autumn afternoon in 1905, what you are looking at is flatly, entirely impossible.
Which brings us to the hook of today's deep dive. And honestly, this is the part of the story that absolutely broke my brain.
It is wild to think about.
Right. This moment, this beautiful, sustained 20-minute flight over an Ohio cow pasture, was arguably the single most important technological leap happening anywhere on the planet at that time. Humanity was severing its absolute tie to the ground.
Yeah, a fundamental shift in human capability.
And yet the seats were empty. It was a moment of profound, unwitnessed wonder. I mean, the Wright brothers, the two men executing this miracle, had actively invited the newspapers to come and watch.
And the reporters simply didn't bother to show up.
They just didn't care. The greatest science magazine in America was handed a first-hand account of this, and they turned it down.
Flatly rejected it.
Meanwhile, across the ocean, the world's leading, highly educated aviation experts had already made up their minds about these two guys from Dayton. They had decided on a single word to describe them, which was liars. Just straight up liars. So today, our mission is clear. We are going to unpack how two bicycle mechanics taught the human race to fly. But more importantly, we are going to explore the profound and honestly fascinating psychology of why the world flatly refused to look up and believe its own eyes for 5 long years.
It's a story about mechanical innovation, certainly, but it's really a story about cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, totally.
It's about what happens when the truth doesn't match the established narrative.
Right.
And how deeply entrenched human beings become in what they have already decided is true.
Okay, let's unpack this. To understand why the world ignored Wilbur and Orville Wright, we first have to understand who they were and the specific nature of what they were accomplishing in the shadows while the world wasn't looking.
Right, because their background is everything here.
Exactly. These were two brothers from Dayton, Ohio. Their primary trade was making and repairing bicycles. They were entirely self-funded.
No wealthy patrons backing them at all.
None. And crucially, neither of them had a university degree.
Which was a huge deal back then.
Yeah.
I mean, in the rigid hierarchy of early 20th century science and engineering, they were absolute nobodies.
Just mechanics.
Right. They were entirely outside the academic establishment. They weren't publishing in peer-reviewed journals. They weren't attending the prestigious European salons where, aeronautics was being debated.
Mm-hmm.
And they weren't securing massive government grants. They were literally just mechanics in a dusty shop.
But that background as bicycle mechanics is the literal key to the sky. I want to dive into this analogy because it unlocked the entire historical mystery for me.
It's the best way to understand their genius, really.
At the time, all the credentialed experts, the people with the massive funding and the degrees, were trying to solve flight by brute force.
Yes.
They were essentially trying to build a ship that floated in the air.
Exactly. The ship-in-the-air paradigm.
Right. And a ship has inherent static stability. You put a well-designed boat in the water, and it wants to stay upright. So the experts were building these massive, inherently stable machines, often with wings angled up in a deep V shape called a dihedral.
Right. To force them to self-correct.
Yes, to force them to be stable. And then they were trying to strap giant engines to them to just force them into the sky. But the Wrights looked at the problem differently. They approached flying a machine the exact same way you approach riding a bicycle.
Because a bicycle is inherently unstable.
Right.
If you just let go of a bicycle, it falls over immediately. It requires the rider to actively balance and control it constantly.
You are the stability.
Exactly. And the Wrights realized that a flying machine in the turbulent, unpredictable ocean of the air couldn't be statically stable like a boat.
It would just flip over.
Right. The wind would just flip a statically stable machine over the moment a gust hit it sideways. It had to be dynamically controlled by the pilot. It had to lean into turns. It was all about balance, pitch, roll, and yaw. For them, it was control first, power second.
Wait, I need to pause here because we throw around words like pitch, roll, and yaw all the time now in modern aviation.
Sure, it's standard terminology today.
But how did they actually achieve that mechanically back then? I mean, if I am a bicycle mechanic in 1900, how do I invent a way to make a rigid wing lean into a turn?
That is the brilliant part, and it comes down to a concept called wing warping.
Wing warping.
Yeah. Wilbur observed a flock of pigeons near the Miami River, and he noticed how they dropped the trailing edge of one wing and raised the other to roll into a turn.
Like twisting their bodies.
Precisely. So they designed their biplane gliders to be flexible. By shifting their hips in a specially designed cradle, the pilot pulled cables that physically twisted the wings of the glider.
That sounds crazy.
It's brilliant. Think of a long cardboard box with the ends removed. If you twist the top right corner down, the angle of the wing on that side increases.
Okay, yeah.
And that creates more lift on that side, pushing that wing up and rolling the entire machine.
So they just twisted the wings and solved it. That sounds almost too simple.
Well, no, it wasn't that easy. And this is where their lack of formal credentials actually benefited them.
How so?
Because they relied entirely on rigorous empirical observation instead of accepted written theory. When they tested wing warping on their 1901 glider in Kitty Hawk, they discovered a terrifying aerodynamic side effect.
Oh, no. What was it?
The wing that was twisted to create more lift also created more drag. So while the glider rolled into the turn, the drag physically pulled the nose of the glider in the opposite direction. It's a phenomenon called adverse yaw.
Wait, so that sounds like trying to steer a car to the left, but the hood of the car violently swings out to the right.
Precisely. It was a lethal flaw. If you were up in the air and that happened, you would crash.
Wow.
And this is where their genius truly shines. In 1902, they realized they needed a movable tail rudder to counteract this.
Okay, so they just slap a rudder on the back.
Not just that. They didn't just add a rudder. They physically linked the rudder cables to the wing warping cradle. So when the pilot warped the wings to roll, the rudder automatically turned to counteract that adverse yaw. They synchronized the controls.
That is incredibly smart.
That 1902 glider, with its coordinated three-axis control, was the true intellectual breakthrough of human flight. The 1903 powered flight, the one everyone knows, was really just adding an engine to an already solved equation.
And speaking of the engine, I read that they couldn't even find a company to build one for them, right? Like the auto manufacturers of the day basically told them it was impossible.
Yeah, they needed an engine that was both light enough and powerful enough, and the established industries rejected them. They said an engine block that light couldn't be cast without cracking.
So what did they do?
The Wrights walked back into their bicycle shop and asked their brilliant shop mechanic, Charlie Taylor, to just build it from scratch.
Just a guy in a bike shop building an airplane engine.
Right. Taylor took a block of aluminum, which was highly unusual and really expensive to use for engine blocks at the time, but absolutely necessary to save weight. And using just a basic lathe and a drill press, he machined a custom 12-horsepower engine in just 6 weeks.
6 weeks. It's astounding. But it wasn't just the engine or the controls that they had to invent. They also had to fight the actual math of their era.
Oh, the aerodynamics math, yes.
You read about them building their own wind tunnel. And honestly, I always pictured something massive and industrial, but it was basically just a wooden box,
It was
right?
an old starch box they modified. It was about 6 feet long, with a fan at one end driven by the stationary engine they used to power the tools in their bicycle shop.
How does an old starch box change the course of human history? I mean, really?
Because the mathematical tables being used by every credentialed aeronautical expert in the world at that time were wrong.
The established science was wrong.
Entirely. These tables were calculated by giants of science like John Smeaton and championed by Otto Lilienthal, who was a huge pioneer. But the Smeaton coefficient, which was the accepted variable for calculating air pressure and lift, was off by a massive margin.
Wow.
When the Wright's 1901 glider failed to generate the lift the equations promised, Wilbur and Orville didn't assume they had built their glider wrong. They assumed the bedrock math of physics was wrong.
Talk about confidence. Two guys who fix flat tires for a living look at the established physics of the 19th century and just say, nah, the math is wrong.
And they proved it. They built incredibly delicate aerodynamic balances inside that little starch box using hacksaw blades and bicycle spokes.
That is so resourceful.
Right. And they tested over 200 different wing shapes. They were testing aspect ratios, cambers, trailing edges. They painstakingly recorded the fluid dynamics of air over curved surfaces and calculated their very own coefficient.
They just wrote their own physics.
They were doing advanced three-dimensional fluid dynamic engineering while the rest of the world was still treating air like it was a solid wall hitting a flat board.
Which brings us to the solitary sands of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Or, well, more specifically, Kill Devil Hills. The date is December 17th, 1903.
The big day.
This is the moment that makes the history books. They take all that wind tunnel data, Charlie Taylor's custom aluminum engine, and that synchronized rudder system, and they drag it all out onto the freezing sand.
And the conditions were brutal that morning. I mean, freezing winds whipping off the Atlantic at over 25 miles per hour.
They're miserable.
But that headwind was exactly what they needed to get enough air flowing over the wings for lift.
So they lay down a 60-foot wooden rail, they rest the Flyer on a small carriage, start the engine, and let it go. And they actually did it 4 times that day.
Yes, people forget there were 4 flights.
Right. The very first flight with Orville at the controls was incredibly brief. It lasted a mere 12 seconds and covered just 120 feet. But they kept taking turns.
Back and forth.
Yeah. By the 4th flight of the day, Wilbur was at the controls, and he stretched that time out to 59 seconds, covering 852 feet.
And conceptualizing what it means to keep a heavier-than-air-powered machine in the air for 59 seconds in 1903 is just staggering.
It's an eternity.
It wasn't just being shot out of a cannon and falling with style. It was being actively piloted. It was pitching up and down over the undulating sand, fighting gravity and fighting this turbulent wind, and the human being at the controls was actively winning that fight.
Yet the audience for this monumental shift in human capability was practically non-existent. The stark absence of a grand audience is staggering.
Almost nobody was there.
There were no dignitaries, there were no reporters from the New York Times, just the sand, the freezing wind, the brothers, and exactly 5 witnesses.
5 locals.
Yeah, 4 local lifesavers from the nearby station and a teenage boy from the village.
The lifesavers literally just helped them carry the heavy machine back up the track after each flight. It was entirely unglamorous.
So casual.
After the wind flipped and actually destroyed the Flyer later that afternoon, the Wrights simply walked back to their camp, ate lunch, and sent a totally casual telegram to their father stating they had succeeded and would be home for Christmas.
They achieved the impossible, and then they went home and quietly got vastly better at it. Kitty Hawk was really just a straight line for 59 seconds. As we established in the opening, Huffman Prairie in Ohio is where they truly mastered the sky.
That was their real laboratory.
Right. Over 1904 and 1905, they refined the engine, they refined the controls, and they extended their flight times from seconds to over 20 minutes. They were flying in complete controlled circles. They could take off, fly until the gas tank ran dry, and land.
They moved from merely achieving flight to achieving true aviation. They weren't just inventors anymore. They were the world's first true pilots, mastering their craft in the total privacy of a cow pasture.
So we arrive at the massive, glaring question that sits at the center of this entire narrative.
The big mystery.
Yeah. If these 2 brothers from Ohio were flying in circles for 20 minutes at a time in 1904 and 1905, why wasn't it front-page news globally? Why wasn't the presidents of the United States taking a special train down to Dayton?
You'd think they would be.
The silence is deafening. To understand it, we really have to look at the psychological state of the public and the press at the turn of the century.
You really have to put yourself in the shoes of an average newspaper reader in 1903.
Okay, paint the picture.
For decades leading up to this exact moment, the very term flying machine was entirely synonymous with crackpot. It literally meant lunatic.
Think about how you feel today, right? When you see a headline about some Silicon Valley startup claiming they've cured aging or, created a perpetual motion machine in a garage or achieved infinite clean energy.
You naturally scroll right past it.
Exactly. You don't even click the article because, intrinsically it's a scam or a massive exaggeration. That was the public in 1903 reading about flying machines. They had massive crank fatigue.
For a few months, some eccentric inventor would claim they had finally solved the problem of flight. And the newspapers would write this highly sensationalized story about it. And it would inevitably turn out to be completely false or result in some dangerous, humiliating failure. The public had been trained by repeated disappointment to view aviation as a realm of fantasy, charlatans, and outright fraud.
And it wasn't just eccentric, nobody's failing either. The absolute pinnacle of this crank fatigue, the defining moment that hardened the public's skepticism into concrete, happened just 9 days before the Wrights succeeded at Kitty Hawk.
Oh, yes.
Samuel Langley's disaster.
Samuel Langley is the crucial context for the world's disbelief here. He was the opposite of the Wright brothers in every conceivable way.
He had all the credentials.
All of them. He was eminent. He was highly respected. He was the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, which is the highest scientific office in the land. And most importantly, he was heavily government funded.
Taxpayer money.
Right. The War Department had given him a $50,000 grant, which was a staggering sum at the time, to develop a flying machine.
Wait, let me get this straight. Langley had massive government funding, the weight of the Smithsonian, the best academic minds at his disposal, and his solution was basically to catapult a houseboat into the Potomac River. How did the math on that even make sense to the scientific establishment?
It didn't make sense from a modern engineering perspective, but it made total sense to the paradigm of the time.
How so?
Langley approached the problem exactly like the ship in the air analogy we discussed earlier. He built a massive, beautifully crafted tandem-wing aircraft he called the aerodrome. It had a powerful custom-built engine.
Okay, so it had power.
But Langley completely ignored the absolute necessity of dynamic pilot control. He assumed if the machine was aerodynamically stable, the pilot would just sit there and steer it lazily like a boat.
Like turning a steering wheel.
Exactly. Furthermore, he tested small-scale models successfully, but he didn't understand the physics of scaling up. A wing that supports a 10-pound model does not scale linearly to support a heavy, man-carrying machine.
So he builds this massive, heavily hyped aerodrome, and he's going to launch it from the roof of a specially modified houseboat.
Yes.
Right in front of Washington, D.C., and right in front of a massive crowd of invited reporters, photographers, and government dignitaries. It was meant to be the glorious, highly publicized triumph of American institutional science.
Instead, it is an absolute catastrophe.
A total mess.
On December 8, 1903, they released the catapult mechanism. The aerodrome, which was fraught with structural weaknesses, basically collapses under the violent stress of the launch.
It just breaks apart.
Instantly. The front wings shear off, and the entire multi-million-dollar pile of canvas and steel drops straight down like a stone into the freezing waters of the Potomac River.
Oh, man.
The pilot, Charles Manley, nearly drowned, tangled in the wreckage.
A spectacular, expensive, deeply embarrassing public belly flop.
Yeah.
And the press absolutely crucified him for it. The reporters had a field day mocking the government waste and the hubris of the scientific establishment.
It was the final nail in the coffin for the idea of heavier-than-air flight, as far as the public was concerned. The most credentialed, best-funded, most brilliant scientific mind of the era had just failed in the most humiliating way possible.
I have to step in here and actually defend the public's skepticism for a second.
Fair enough.
If you, as a citizen in 1903 had just watched this highly publicized, government-funded project turn into wet wreckage, wouldn't you also roll your eyes when literally 9 days later you hear a rumor that two completely unknown bicycle mechanics from Ohio quietly whispered that they had figured it out?
I would absolutely roll my eyes. That any rational, critically thinking person would. The timing could not have been worse for the Wright brothers. The well of public trust had been completely poisoned by Langley's failure.
Just to cement how absolute the era's certainty was that flight was impossible, we can look at an editorial published by the New York Times just weeks before Kitty Hawk.
Oh, the famous prophecy.
Yes. The Times mused on the future of aviation and confidently stated that developing a functioning flying machine might take between 1 million to 10 million years to achieve.
1 to 10 million years.
Unbelievable.
And that wasn't written as hyperbole. That was reflecting the genuine scientific consensus of the day. They viewed flight as an evolutionary impossibility for human engineering, something that would require a geological timescale for human intellect to ever conquer.
So when December 17th happens, the world has already locked the door and thrown away the key on the concept of human flight.
Firmly locked.
But that cultural skepticism only explains the initial silence. It explains why people didn't believe the first whispers in 1903. But what about 1904? What about 1905? What about those 20-minute flights circling the cow pasture?
That's where it gets complicated.
The ongoing media blackout requires us to look at the specific, frankly baffling interactions between the Wrights and the press. Because the Wrights were not hiding in 1904 and 1905. They actively invited the press to Huffman Prairie.
They sent out letters, they contacted the local Dayton papers, essentially saying, hey, we're going to be flying our machine out in the pasture on these days. Come on down. And the reporters just didn't show up.
How does a local newspaper reporter ignore an invitation to see a flying machine, just a trolley right away? Like, it's right outside of town.
It is the ultimate manifestation of confirmation bias. The editors knew flight was impossible. They had just seen Langley fail.
Right.
Therefore, any invitation to see flight must be a waste of time or a practical joke or just more crackpot nonsense. The reporters literally decided it wasn't worth the hour-long streetcar ride to the edge of town to see for themselves.
But somebody did go, and this leads to one of my absolute favorite details in this entire story.
It's a great historical quirk.
The very first eyewitness account of a powered airplane in flight, banking, and turning was not written by a journalist from the New York Times or a reporter for a major scientific journal. It was written by a man named Amos Root.
Amos Root was a beekeeper.
The beekeeper.
Yeah.
He ran a highly successful apiary supply company in Medina, Ohio. He was a deeply curious technology enthusiast. He actually drove his car an Oldsmobile runabout, which was an incredibly rare technological marvel in itself at the time, over nearly 200 miles of terrible dirt roads all the way to Huffman Prairie just because he was curious.
Just to see if the rumors were true.
Right. And he stood there in the grass and he watched Wilbur and Orville fly in circles. He saw the miracle with his own 2 eyes.
Because he witnessed it, he felt a moral compulsion to record it for history. But he's not a traditional journalist. So he wrote this incredibly detailed, passionate eyewitness account of the first sustained human flight, and he published it in his own niche magazine, which was called Gleanings in Bee Culture.
I cannot get over the irony of this. The most world-changing news of the 20th century, the realization of a dream humanity has had since the dawn of time, and it is published nestled right next to articles about honey extraction yields, smoker fuel, and how to winterize your beehives.
This is astonishing.
It's so funny.
But Amos Root understood the magnitude of what he saw. He knew this belonged on a bigger stage than a beekeeping journal. So he took his first-hand, documented scoop, and he offered it to Scientific American, the premier, most respected science magazine in America.
And Scientific American gave him a flat refusal. They rejected the story entirely.
Oh, and then cut it.
They didn't even send an intern on a train to Ohio to investigate. They just dismissed it outright. In fact, Scientific American actively published editorial pieces during this time mocking the rumors, expressing deep doubt about what they termed the Wrights' fabled performances. The gatekeepers of science refused to even crack the gate to look outside.
It highlights a really dangerous flaw in institutional thinking. When an institution considers itself the ultimate arbiter of truth, it becomes incredibly vulnerable to rejecting any truth that originates outside its own walls.
Yeah.
The Wrights didn't fit the approved profile of inventors. They didn't have the pedigree. Therefore, their invention was dismissed as a fable.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting. Up to this point, the narrative is basically the brilliant, innocent Wright brothers are being ignored by a foolish, stubborn world.
Right, the underdog story.
But the Wrights were not just innocent victims of a skeptical press. They actually made it worse for themselves. They inflicted a massive wound on their own credibility. Starting in 1906 and lasting for roughly 2.5 years, the Wright brothers completely stopped flying.
Total halt.
They grounded themselves, they packed up the machine, locked the doors of their shed, and went completely dark. Why on earth would you do that when you are actively struggling to be believed?
Because they were absolutely terrified of having their inventions stolen. And this is where the tension between innovation and intellectual property violently collides.
Okay, let's look at that.
They had applied for a patent not on the airplane itself, but specifically on their method of aerodynamic control, the synchronization of the wing warping and the tail rudder. But a patent is only as good as your ability to defend it in court, and the Wrights were not rich men.
They realized that if they kept flying in open fields, eventually, trained engineers and rival inventors were going to show up with long-lens cameras.
Exactly.
They would take photographs, study the mechanism, and figure out exactly how the three-axis control worked. Once that secret was out, anyone could build an airplane.
Exactly. So they decided they needed to secure airtight, financially guaranteed contracts with buyers, specifically governments or military departments, before they would show anyone the machine working again. They were hunting for buyers, but they were doing it entirely behind closed doors.
Let's analyze the psychological optics of this decision. Think about it from the perspective of the world in 1906.
It looks incredibly suspicious.
Right. You have a public already deeply primed by decades of frauds to disbelieve any claims of flight. Then you have two uncredentialed men claiming they have achieved a genuine miracle. But when a government procurement officer asks to see this miracle, the Wrights say, no, we can't show you until you sign a contract and pay us a massive sum of money.
To a skeptical world, men who claim a miracle and then hide in the shadows look exactly like men with something to hide. It is the textbook behavior of a fraud.
Yep.
Their own caution directly fed the narrative that they were charlatans. They created an information vacuum by locking the doors of that shed, and the world rushed to fill that vacuum with scorn and suspicion. They unintentionally gave the skeptics all the ammunition they needed to dismiss them entirely.
That scorn wasn't just confined to the United States. In America, the reaction to their lockdown was largely silence and, bureaucratic indifference. But overseas, the reaction morphed into something much louder, much more aggressive, and deeply personal.
Oh, the Europeans were furious.
While the Wrights are locking their doors in Ohio, creating that vacuum, the rest of the world isn't standing still. Over in Europe, that vacuum was being filled with intense nationalistic outrage, particularly in France.
At this time, France fiercely viewed itself as the rightful, undisputed home of aviation.
They had the history.
They did. They had the legacy of the Montgolfier brothers and the first hot air balloons back in the 1780s. By the early 1900s, they had a vibrant, heavily funded, highly socially prestigious culture of balloonists and early aeronauts. Flying was a gentleman's sport over there, a matter of intense national pride.
So when rumors start trickling across the Atlantic that two unknown bicycle repairmen in the American Midwest have somehow leapfrogged the entire French aviation establishment by miles, the reaction is not scientific curiosity. It is violent contempt.
The central figure in this European backlash was a man named Ernest Archdeacon.
Archdeacon, yeah.
He's a wealthy lawyer, a sportsman, and a founding member of the Aero Club de France. He was essentially the patron saint of French aviation efforts, pouring his own fortune into funding aviation prizes. And he took the Wright brothers' claims as a direct personal insult.
He openly and viciously scorned them. Archdeacon and the Aero Club were funding their own innovators, men who were building these statically stable machines we talked about, making tiny, uncontrolled, terrifying hop flights of a few dozen feet. And the French considered these hops to be the true, absolute forefront of global aviation. The French press picked up on Archdeacon's outrage, and they launched a full-scale smear campaign against the Wrights. They dubbed the brothers bluffers. Bluffers.
It became a point of nationalistic duty to debunk the Americans. The rhetoric was incredibly heated. The European experts simply could not reconcile their own lack of progress with the rumors of American mastery.
There is a quote that perfectly distills this global sentiment into a single, cruel sneer. In early 1906, the Paris edition of the New York Herald ran an editorial about the Wright brothers, and they concluded that Wilbur and Orville were, quote, in fact, either flyers or liars.
Lord.
And it was abundantly clear which side the paper was taking. The French establishment confidently, loudly announced to the world that they, the French, would be the ones to make the true first public flight, and that the Americans were nothing but grifters holding out for a payday.
This intense international hostility created a paralyzing deadlock for the Wrights. It was a brutal business stalemate.
It was the ultimate catch-22. The Wrights absolutely refused to bring their plane out of the shed and fly it without a signed, financially guaranteed contract to protect their patent. But the European syndicates and the military buyers absolutely refused to sign a contract or hand over any money without seeing the machine fly first.
And you can't really blame the buyers. You wouldn't buy a house sight unseen. You certainly wouldn't buy a revolutionary, supposedly impossible flying machine from accused bluffers without seeing it work. A wealthy French group, the Weiler Syndicate, was interested, but even they demanded a public demonstration before releasing funds.
So they are completely stuck.
Right.
And underneath this business impasse, there is a massive undercurrent of ego.
The role that wounded expert ego played in maintaining this deadlock cannot be overstated. The European experts, men like Archdeacon, had invested immense amounts of money, time, and social capital into solving the problem of flight using the ship-in-the-air model.
They were heavily invested.
Extremely. They had engineering degrees, they had immense prestige. Their pride simply could not absorb the possibility of being beaten by two uncredentialed mechanics. To admit the Wrights had succeeded meant admitting that their own methodology, their own physics, and their own societal status were fundamentally flawed.
That's a hard pill to swallow.
It was vastly easier and psychologically safer to brand the Wrights as liars than to confront the possibility of their own obsolescence.
It's cognitive dissonance on a massive international scale. They literally couldn't comprehend a reality where they were wrong, so they rejected the reality. But this deadlock couldn't last forever. The tension was building, the Wrights' funds were dwindling, and it could only be broken by an undeniable head-on collision with reality.
The pressure finally reached a breaking point in early 1908. The Wrights realized that their extreme secrecy was doing more harm than good, and they finally managed to negotiate contingent deals.
Contingent being the key word.
Right. The U.S. Army Signal Corps agreed to a contract for a military flyer, and the French Weiler Syndicate also agreed to a manufacturing deal, but both were strictly legally contingent on highly scrutinized public demonstrations.
They finally had to put up or shut up. They had to prove they were flyers, not liars. So they divide and conquer. Orville stays in America to build a flyer and demonstrate for the Army, and Wilbur packs up a flyer in crates, gets on a boat, and sails right into the lion's den. He sails for France.
The setting for this demonstration is a crucial piece of the drama. It was August 8, 1908, at the Hunaudières racecourse, near the town of Le Mans, France.
I want you to picture the scene at this racecourse. The grandstands are packed, and they are not packed with adoring fans. They are packed with hostile skeptics.
Oh, they were ready to boo him out of the country.
The cream of the French aviation world is there. Journalists from all over Europe are there. Ernest Archdeacon himself is there. And they have all arrived half expecting, perhaps fully hoping, to witness a humiliating failure. They want to see the American bluffers finally exposed.
The atmosphere was thick with tension and derision. Wilbur Wright, dressed in his trademark flat cap and conservative business suit, spent hours quietly, meticulously making his pre-flight checks, tightening turnbuckles, checking cables, while the crowd looked on, growing increasingly impatient and mockingly vocal.
Then he starts the engine. The 1,500-pound iron weight drops from the derrick, pulling the rope, shooting the plane down the launch rail, and the machine lifts into the air.
And he doesn't just do a straight line.
Right. Wilbur doesn't just fly in a straight line. He doesn't just do a little uncontrolled, terrifying hop to prove it can get off the ground. He takes off, he banks smoothly, and he begins to carve these graceful, perfect circles and figure eights over the racecourse. He demonstrates a level of absolute mastery and fluid dynamic control that no European flyer had even approached in their wildest dreams.
The technical contrast was mind-blowing to the crowd. The few European machines that had managed to hop into the air by 1908 were barely manageable. They had no roll control.
They were just skidding.
When they turned, they skidded flatly through the air, completely at the mercy of the wind, and often crashed. And here was Wilbur Wright, banking the wings, handling this machine in 3 dimensions with the effortless grace of a man riding a bicycle.
The whiplash of the crowd was immediate and total. You have this grandstand full of people who spent years calling him a liar, and within 2 minutes of him leaving the rail, their entire worldview completely collapses.
A total paradigm shift.
The reaction is almost religious. A stunned French spectator, a prominent aviation backer himself, watched that flight, turned to a reporter, and famously admitted, "Beside the Wrights, we are as children."
It was an absolute, unconditional capitulation. Even Ernest Archdeacon, the man who had led the international smear campaign, watched Wilbur land, walked up to him, and to his credit, publicly admitted that he had wronged them.
He owned up to it.
He did. Another prominent skeptic in the crowd was so overwhelmed that he called doubting the brothers the greatest mistake of the century.
The news electrifies the world. The telegraph wires light up. The era of the lyre is dead. Over the next few weeks, Wilbur moves to a larger field nearby called Conque d'Ivoire, and the crowds explode. They grow from 200 skeptics on that first day to 10,000 cheering fans to a reported 100,000 people a day flocking just to watch Wilbur Wright fly in circles.
The vindication was absolute.
The empty cow pasture of Ohio is finally replaced by an adoring global audience.
But pushing the absolute boundaries of human capability always carries an inherent danger and an inevitable cost. We cannot just focus on the romantic triumph in France without acknowledging the sobering reality that occurred simultaneously back in America.
Right, because while Wilbur was experiencing this unprecedented, ecstatic triumph in France, Orville was at Fort Myer in Virginia, executing his demonstration flights for the U.S. Army Signal Corps.
For several weeks in the late summer and early autumn of 1908, Orville was dazzling the American military and the public. He was setting incredible endurance records, flying for over an hour at a time, proving the machine's absolute reliability. The American press, previously so blind, had finally woken up and were reporting on every flight.
But on September 17, 1908, disaster struck.
Yes, a terrible day.
Orville took off with a passenger, a young Army officer named Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge. They were circling the parade ground at an altitude of about 150 feet when they heard a strange tapping sound.
The propeller.
Before Orville could cut the engine, a propeller blade essentially delaminated and shattered. It severed a wire bracing the tail rudder. The rudder folded flat, the plane lost all aerodynamic control, and it plunged roughly 75 feet straight down into the dirt parade ground.
Orville was severely injured. He suffered broken ribs, a severely broken leg, and deep back injuries that would cause him excruciating pain for the rest of his life.
It's awful.
But his passenger, Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge, suffered a fractured skull from hitting the wooden struts of the aircraft. He died that evening in the military hospital without ever regaining consciousness.
He became the very first person in history to die in a powered airplane crash. It is a moment we have to handle with immense dignity. It reminds us that this wasn't just a romantic adventure. It was a deadly, serious, unforgiving, technological frontier.
Exactly.
The triumph at Le Mans and the tragic cost at Fort Myer arrived tightly woven together. Humanity had conquered the sky, but the sky was going to demand a brutal toll.
It firmly established that aviation was a reality, with all the incredible potential and all the lethal risks that reality entails. Flight was no longer theoretical, it was practical, and it was dangerous.
You would think, after the global triumph at Le Mans and even the tragic validation of the Fort Myer crash, that the matter was settled forever. The Wrights had proven the technology. The world believed they could fly. End of story.
If only it were that simple.
But human nature, and especially institutional pride, are deeply, fiercely stubborn. Proving the machine worked was only the first part of the battle. The second, and perhaps even harder part, was getting the world to agree that they were the first to do it.
The institutional denial the Wrights faced even after 1908 was staggering, and it lasted for decades. We have to look back at the Smithsonian Institution.
Okay, yeah.
Remember Samuel Langley, their former secretary, who dropped his massive aerodrome into the Potomac just 9 days before Kitty Hawk.
The houseboat guy.
Exactly. Even after the Wrights proved they had flown first, the Smithsonian absolutely refused to give the Wrights their due credit.
The Smithsonian engaged in a decades-long campaign of historical revisionism that is almost unbelievable to read about today. They heavily favored their own man, Langley, to protect the museum's reputation.
It went far beyond just writing favorable articles. In 1914, the Smithsonian secretly hired an aviation pioneer named Glenn Curtiss, who, by the way, happened to be locked in a bitter patent war with the Wrights at the time, to take Langley's ruined aerodrome out of storage.
This is so devious.
The Smithsonian allowed Curtiss to fundamentally modify it. He secretly changed the structural trussing, he reshaped the wings, and he added modern flight controls that Langley never possessed. Curtiss managed to fly this highly modified aerodrome briefly off the water in Hammondsport, New York.
And the Smithsonian used that completely doctored test flight to claim that Langley's machine was the first airplane capable of flight, entirely undermining the Wrights' achievement.
Pure deception.
They put the aerodrome on display with a deeply misleading label praising Langley and essentially erasing Kitty Hawk. It was an institutional betrayal of the highest order. The most trusted museum in America was actively lying to the public to protect the ego of its former leader and secure its own legacy.
Wilbur had died of typhoid fever in 1912, so Orville had to fight this battle alone. He was so justifiably furious about this historical gaslighting that he refused to donate the original 1903 Kitty Hawk Flyer to the Smithsonian.
He sent it into exile. The most iconic, important artifact of American engineering spent decades sitting in the Science Museum in London.
In England.
Yeah. Orville decided he would rather let the British have it than let the Smithsonian display it next to their lies. The Smithsonian didn't finally relent, apologize, and correct the historical record until the late 1940s. The original flyer wasn't returned to the United States until 1948, near the very end of Orville's life.
It perfectly illustrates how deeply entrenched institutional narratives can be. Institutions are incredibly reluctant to admit they were wrong, especially when prestige and historical legacy are on the line. They will twist facts to fit their established paradigm rather than change the paradigm to fit the facts.
And the debate over who flew first doesn't even stop with the Smithsonian. If you travel outside the United States today, you will find that the credit for the first flight is still fiercely debated. We have to acknowledge the Santos-Dumont debate.
Right. Alberto Santos Dumont was a brilliant, incredibly charismatic Brazilian inventor living in Paris. He was one of those prominent balloonists we mentioned earlier, deeply beloved by the French public.
A real showman.
Yes. He eventually transitioned into heavier-than-air machines. In 1906, during that crucial period when the Wrights were hiding their machine in the shed in Ohio, Santos Dumont made a public flight in Paris in a box kite-like machine he called the 14Bs. He flew it for a few hundred feet before a massive cheering crowd.
To this day, many people, especially in Brazil and parts of Europe, champion Santos Dumont as the true pioneer, the first man to make a true, unassisted public flight.
It is entirely necessary to impartially explain why this is contested, because it highlights how fluid the definition of history can be. The debate hinges entirely on how you define a first flight.
The criteria.
Exactly. The Wrights used a wooden monorail to take off in 1903, and later used a falling weight catapult system to assist their takeoffs in Ohio in early European demonstrations.
They did that for purely practical reasons. The bicycle wheels of the era would just sink into the deep sand at Kitty Hawk, and the long grass at Huffman Prairie was too bumpy to build up takeoff speed. A rail was a practical engineering solution to their terrain.
Exactly. Yeah. But the supporters of Santos Dumont argue that a true airplane must be an entirely self-contained vehicle. It must be able to take off completely under its own power, rolling on its own landing gear, without external catapult assistance.
Okay, I see that argument.
Santos Dumont's 14Bs had wheels and took off unassisted. Furthermore, Santos Dumont flew in public, in front of the press and certified observers from the Aero Club, while the Wrights' early foundational flights were witnessed only by a handful of locals. So, depending on the specific criteria, you prioritize three-axis control and duration, which the Wrights completely mastered years earlier, versus unassisted takeoff and official public verification, you arrive at very different historical conclusions.
So what does this all mean? When we look back at the empty cow pasture, the sneering editorials in the Parisian press, the tragic cost of innovation, the years of silence, and the bitter fights over historical credit, what is the core truth here? I think it boils down to this.
The big takeaway.
The world didn't fail to be amazed by the concept of flight. The world failed to notice that flight had actually happened because the world had already made a firm, unyielding decision about what was possible and what was impossible.
Humans are deeply pattern-seeking creatures. When the established pattern says flying machines equal frauds, cranks, and failures, we stop looking for anomalies.
We just tune it out.
We stop interrogating the evidence. The marvel of the age was literally sitting in plain sight, circling a field in Ohio for 20 minutes at a time. And the world actively looked away because the truth did not fit the established narrative.
The hardest thing the Wright brothers did wasn't achieving aerodynamic lift. It wasn't building a wind tunnel out of a starch box or discovering the mechanism of wing warping to conquer adverse yaw. The absolute hardest thing they did was convincing a world that had already made up its mind to simply look up from its newspaper and admit it was wrong.
It is a profound, timeless lesson in the dangers of absolute certainty. When the scientific experts, the media institutions, and the general public all align to declare something impossible, the truth often has to fight a brutal, exhausting, decades-long war just to be seen.
And that brings us directly to you, the listener, because this isn't just a story about wood, canvas, and aluminum in 1903. This is a story about human nature right now.
It happens every day.
I want you to challenge yourself and consider how often we today dismiss the truth simply because it doesn't come neatly packaged with the right credentials. How often do we roll our eyes at a new idea because the person presenting it doesn't have a degree from the right university, or the funding of a major tech conglomerate, or the approval of established experts? How often does our own modern crank fatigue blind us to genuine, disruptive innovation?
We all have our own internal Smithsonian, protecting our own established narratives and guarding us against ideas that challenge our comfort.
Exactly. So I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to mull over when you finish this deep dive. If the most monumental shift in human history, the physical conquering of the air, was ignored for 5 long years because it happened in a cow pasture by two uncredentialed nobodies, what impossible world-changing truth is currently circling a metaphorical cow pasture right now? What absolute marvel is happening out in the open entirely ignored by all of us simply because we've already decided the future can't possibly be here yet?